Bonsoir. Ah, ça marche, toi? Donc,
Ça
c'est bien.
marche.
On dit toujours, hein, quand ça commence un petit peu avec des problèmes techniques, après tout va très très bien. Donc vous allez passer une super conférence. Je suis très contente pour vous. Donc c'est le troisième volet de cet après-midi New Worlds of Fantasy, un forum qui existe depuis le 2010 et qui s'intéresse au rapport entre littérature et cinéma. Donc là, vous allez assister à une conférence assez exceptionnelle de notre invité que j'appellerai d'honneur. Il est cette année notre président du jury international. Il a aussi livré une carte blanche avec 5 films qui sont ses références cinématographiques majeures dans le domaine du fantastique, qui étaient 5 grands piliers de l'histoire du cinéma. Et là, il va revenir sur son rapport à la littérature, qui est multiple, complexe et intense, parce qu'il est à la fois auteur, mais aussi adapté au cinéma des œuvres littéraires très très complexes et très très belles, et aussi très iconiques. Je vous demande d'accueillir chaleureusement sur scène David Cronenberg.
Merci.
Eh bien voilà, on y est. Je vous annonce aussi tout de suite que je ne vais pas passer 30 minutes ou 45 minutes à poser moi seul des questions.
asking questions. So to David Cronenberg, I really want, and I'm counting on your participation to ask your questions, while we, of course, remain on the specific subject here, which is the connection between literature and film in David Cronenberg's work. I'd like to start with the first question about the title of this conference, how literature has consumed David Cronenberg's work, and I'd like to know how literature can consume anything, and how is literature perhaps more important than cinema in your films, whether they're adapted from literary works or not?
The voice on this is a woman, so it's very strange when I see,
I can speak as a woman if you want to.
Well, it's a very cute title to say that my work has been consumed by literature. I don't know that that's completely accurate, of course. My one novel is called Consumed, Consumé, but it's true that my father was a writer, and I grew up as a boy. When I would fall asleep at night, I would fall asleep to the sound of his typewriter typing, and for me, writing was a natural thing to do, and I really felt that I would be a novelist, not at all a filmmaker.
Est-ce que quelqu'un a déjà une question dans le public, peut-être pour enchaîner éventuellement là-dessus, ou je continue? Si je vois une main qui se lève, j'arrête, sinon je continue. Eh bien, je continue. Alors justement, Sorry? Justement, pour rebondir sur ce que vous venez de dire, est-ce que vos premiers rapports étant justement liés à la littérature, comment est-ce que votre rapport au cinéma est arrivé? À quel moment vous êtes senti cinéphile, vous êtes intéressé
with the cinema, and were you a film lover? How did you get involved with cinema?
Well, it was really, I think I was kidnapped by cinema by accident, I was, as a child, I saw movies from everywhere. It was very natural as a child to go to the cinema every Saturday. And that was in the days when people were not worried about children being kidnapped, and so we children walked by ourselves to the cinema, and you would see huge streams of children walking towards the cinema on every Saturday afternoon, and so it was just very natural for me. It was like breathing. Cinema was it was before television really was a force, and then in the maybe late 1950s, early 1960s. There was the thing called the art film, which was really films from other countries. So suddenly great film artists like Fellini, like Bergman, like Kurosawa, like Truffaut, their films would come to Toronto, Canada, which is where I lived and still live. And we began then to see different ways that cinema could exist, different societies, different cultures, different aesthetic. And that's when I began to really feel the power of cinema as an art form. Because up until that time, I was seeing cowboy films and, you know, Hopalong Cassidy, Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, you know, cartoons, children's films, basically. Shall I tell the story? I have a story to tell about.
Say it.
Yes, okay. I've told the story many times, so if you've looked me up on the internet, you will be very bored. But when I was a child going to the cinema, and it was a theater called the Pylon, but I was living in a section of Toronto that was very Italian. There were many Italian immigrants, so many that it could support a theater that only showed films in Italian for Italians. And it was across the street from my childhood cinema. It was called The Studio. And I remember coming out of my theater having seen a cowboy movie. And across the road were people coming out of the studio, and they were all adults. They were not children. And they were all weeping. They were crying as they came out. And I was shocked because this was adults, you know, grown-up people weeping because of something they had seen in the cinema. And I thought, this is amazing that movies could have the power to have this emotional impact on grown people. And I crossed the road to see what movie that was that they had seen. And I saw a poster, and it said, La Strada, de Fellini. And that was the first time that I had the sense that cinema had great power and was not just an entertainment. But I didn't start making my own films until the 1960s, when it was underground filmmaking from New York, which was the inspiration, because that movement said you don't have to study film at a film school, which I never did. You don't have to go to Hollywood and learn the craft of cinema over many years. You just grab a camera and go make a movie. And that was very exciting and very liberating. And this was all New York underground, Ed M. Schwiller, Kenneth Anger. These were wonderful underground filmmakers from New York. And that had a huge influence on me. And that's when I started to think that maybe I could make films myself, but I wasn't thinking as a career. These were underground films, and you didn't make money from them, you know.
Après, vous avez dit aussi récemment que vous avez pris à peu près 50 ans avant de vous autoriser à écrire un roman, donc en l'occurrence Consumé. Pourquoi est-ce qu'à l'époque, vous êtes senti autorisé finalement ou légitime de faire des films
to make films, but not to write novels? What kept you from writing novels at the time?
Yes, well, I was always writing as a young person, you know, short stories and things, and I really, you know, the novel that I did write, which has been published relatively recently, I really thought I would write that 50 years ago. It took me that long to realize that I could write a novel. I did write short stories. I sent them to. I was reading science fiction magazines. One was called Fantasy and Science Fiction. One was called Galaxy. One was called Astounding. These were American sci-fi and fantasy magazines that I would get every month and read. And I did write a couple of short stories, and I did send them to be published when I was 15, 16. And I actually got good letters back from the editors saying, you know, we will almost publish this, not quite, you know, come back. Send us some more, and then I never did. And then I began, you know, I was enough of a techno nerd that I was interested in the technology of cinema. And I wondered, how do you get the sound to synchronize with the picture? You know, this was a big problem because when you have your iPhone, it's not a problem. But when you're shooting with film and you have a separate tape recorder to record the sound, it is a problem. And so I looked up movies, cameras in Encyclopedia Britannica, and I started to. That wasn't Wikipedia then, and I started to think, I should try this, So I rented a camera and started to make some movies with my friends, and that's how I started, really very innocently, to be involved in filmmaking.
Y a-t-il une question dans le public? Voilà, monsieur.
Yes, there's a gentleman.
Au 10e rang à peu près, on va dire.
10 rows back. Please wait for the microphone.
Pour la traduction aussi.
Yeah, good afternoon. You said at the start that in your childhood you were rocked to sleep by your father's typewriter. I was wondering what he wrote, and did that influence you in your relationship to literature and to film and the subjects of your films?
When I was that child, my father was writing for newspapers. He was a journalist primarily, not a fiction writer. And he would be writing. He also wrote about stamps, philately. He wrote about stamps for a newspaper called The Telegram. This was a Toronto newspaper. Every week he would write about stamps for stamp collectors. He also wrote financial reports and things like that. And it was only sometime later that I realized that in the 1940s he had published and written many stories for a magazine called True Canadian Crime Stories. And he would often write all of the articles for the magazine under different names so that people would think that there were a lot of writers, But this was more documentary. These were dramatizations of real crime stories. And I still have those magazines. And it was very touching for me to see this because I didn't really realize that he had done that in the past. So my attachment to the cinema of crime is legitimate, It's hereditary.
Quelqu'un d'autre? Oui, le monsieur. Juste là.
I'll try in English, if I may. So, since this is about literature, I'll try to say it around literature. So, literature is fiction and non-fiction, right? And so I was wondering what role did non-fiction have in your movie life? Because your movies are a lot around psychology, nervous systems, cars. So what role does non-fiction, literature in non-fiction have in your movie life?
Good question. I was also always a science nerd, I loved insects and animals and science. And at one point, in fact, I really thought that I would be an organic chemist. I went at the University of Toronto. My first time at the University of Toronto, I was studying organic chemistry. So I loved art and literature, but I also loved science and technology. And I wasn't sure really which way I would end. I actually was very interested, for example, in the career of Isaac Asimov, who was an American-Russian writer who was a scientist, a legitimate scientist, a working scientist who also wrote science fiction, and I thought perhaps that might be the way I went. But when I started to study science, I realized that I was more interested in inventing science than actually discovering it, For example, I basically invented stem cells in my movie Rabid. I invented it in 1972, or 5, I think, I can't remember. But so I realized that I didn't have the patience for the kind of study that you had to do to be a serious scientist. You had to spend years in a laboratory constructing experiments and so on if you were going to do original research, which was what excited me. And so, but I always read science, I was always, and still do, reading articles about science, books about science. So that was my sort of non-fiction reading would primarily be that. I read all kinds of things. I mean, I love reading about the Russian mafia, endlessly amusing. So, so yes, I didn't only read fiction. I was very interested in these other things.
Le monsieur avec le t-shirt où c'est écrit Watch More Movies. Allez hop.
The gentleman whose
On
t-shirt
peut
says
avoir un
watch
micro
more
juste
movies.
au deuxième rang, s'il vous plaît, au milieu. Merci.
Dans la littérature qui n'appartient pas à la fiction, il y a effectivement
Literature that's not fictional, you have scientific literature. There's also philosophy that you've also mentioned a lot in your carte blanche, particularly existentialist philosophy. Could you talk a bit about your philosophical inspirations beyond existentialism?
Yes, well, of course, as a young person, you eventually come up against the question of death and life and religion and God or no God and afterlife or no afterlife, and I think that's begins to be the basis of most philosophy. It's certainly the basis of almost all religions. And so I think as any sensitive, interested human being, you have to decide, you have to make some decisions about your life and religion and so on. My parents were atheists, but they were not militant. They were just, you know, my mother said to me, some people believe in God, some people don't. You have to decide yourself, and so on and so on. So philosophy was appealed to me. I took some courses at the University of Toronto on the history of philosophy and so on. I came to feel that the art that was most interesting to me was art that provoked philosophical thought. And I think of my, you know, people have said to me, so in your movies you really want to scare people. And I said, absolutely, it's not, I don't even think about that. It's for me, making a film is a philosophical voyage. I'm trying to figure out what is the human condition, what it is to be a human being, what it is to exist, what is it to not exist. And that, of course, leads you, if you start to think that way, you either go to religion, you go to philosophy, and that's basically where I think I have said at times, I feel that I'm an existentialist. Of course, there are many different varieties of existentialism. It was very popular in the 1950s and 60s, and then has seemed to not be very popular now. You know, not too many people talk about existentialism. But to me, it's my version of it is not quite Sartrean. It's not quite Jean-Paul Sartre, but it's that seemed to me to be the most accurate description of life as I was living it and as I felt it to be. So that's why I keep talking about that stuff.
On a d'autres mains qui se lèvent tout devant.
Hands up right in front.
Peut-être encore une question, puis après on va éventuellement
One more question, and then
we'll
discuss adapting fiction to the screen.
I have a question. You got killed by this guy. I have a question. How did you get in touch with the production of Jason X?
The director of Jason X had worked on my films as a special effects coordinator. He was doing the special effects, and then he was an American, but he came to Toronto for various reasons. People come to different countries and different cities because they get tax breaks, they get some money invested, and so on. And so when he had an opportunity to direct his own film, which was Jason X or Jason 10. He asked me to act in the movie. Of course, I get killed before the opening credits, so I don't have much of a life as a character, but I did that as a favor because he wanted the security and the acknowledgement. So that's how that happened.
Thank you.
Oui, donc pour revenir peut-être vraiment à la question littéraire, la question que je me
issue of
posais en fait,
literature, the
c'était
question that
quand on
I
regarde
was asking is that when we
votre,
look at
votre
your
filmographie, on voit que, en tout cas, pendant
filmography,
la première
or at
grosse
least the
partie, les 15
really
premières années,
first 15 years, you worked on original screenplays. In 1983, in The Dead Zone, to see you adapt a novel, and not by just anyone. What motivated you in your careers to adapt material that was not yours? And were you afraid to confront a screenplay that was written by someone other than yourself?
What induced me to do the screenplay, to make The Dead Zone was desperation and poverty. So I was, of course, as I say, I was very influenced by the art film of the 50s and 60s. And the feeling there was, it was the auteur theory, you know, which originally was created, that theory was developed by French critics like Truffaut and Godard before they were filmmakers. And their auteur theory was that directors really had a huge impact on filmmaking. Now, we know that now, and everybody assumes that a director has created in some way the film that he's made. But in those days, they were looking at Hollywood films. And Hollywood films, the director was anonymous, you know, Howard Hawks, John Ford. Nobody outside of Hollywood knew who those guys were. Everybody was interested in the movie stars, but nobody paid any attention to the directors. And these French critics, rightly, noticed that these directors had a very personal imprint on all the films that they made, and they were trying to convey that to the people that they were writing for the various magazines, Carré du Cinéma and so on. That was the original auteur theory. It was to redeem Hollywood directors. But it became the idea that if you were a director, you should write your own film, and then you were the true author of your film. But the truth is, of course, that those two things are very different. You can be a good director and a terrible writer, and of course you can be you can be a good writer and a terrible director. And those two things don't come together very often, that you could be good at both those things, because they're very different kinds of creativity. As I was making my first films, I had to write them because that was how I seduced producers to give me money. They wanted the scripts that I was writing, but they didn't want me as a director because I had very little experience as a director. And I would say, if you want Shivers, you want Rabbit, you want this script, you have to take me as director because I won't give it to you otherwise. And so that was, going along, I felt, yes, this is the auteur theory. I am the embodiment of the auteur theory. L'auteur, c'est moi. So, and then, because, as I say, for financial reasons and other reasons, I was approached to direct The Dead Zone, based on the very successful novel by Stephen King. And there were 5 scripts already written of that. And I thought, okay, I need to do this. I need to make some money. I need to do a movie that will get major distribution by a major Hollywood distributor. How can I do this? Because I am not writing the screenplay. And so I had to figure a way to work with, I chose one of the screenplays. One of them was written by Stephen King. It was the worst, by far. I mean, I'm sure he'll admit this, because he's not a screenwriter, he's a novelist. And there was one written by a man named Jeffrey Baum, and it was very close. I thought it was really interesting, and it was quite different from the novel, which I felt it had to be, because the novel worked as a novel, but it did not work as a movie. And so I worked with him in the way that it is normal for some directors, most directors, to work with a screenwriter. And I gradually really enjoyed the process. I was surprised that this is me, not the auteur, but the director. And ultimately, I was very happy with the movie. It was very successful. And I realized that there is a way that you can fuse yourself with a writer, another writer, in this case, basically Stephen King. There can be a fusion of the two of you to create a new thing that neither one of you could create separately. I would never have written The Dead Zone myself, but I was very happy with the movie that resulted. So it changed my attitude, and I stopped being a sort of a snob, and realized that it would be quite okay to adapt a novel or to work with somebody else's original screenplay. That's how that developed.
Une question au premier rang. Voilà.
Thank you. Just a little anecdote. I've just been teaching a science fiction film class at university, and the film that freaked them out the most was Videodrome. None other movie moved them as much, my students, as much as your film. And I thought it was quite amazing that a film which is over 30 years old still has this power. But my actual question goes back to back to what you said about the process. You've written original screenplays. You've adapted screenplays, you've written a novel. How would you compare the different processes? The different process of writing, of original screenplay, adapting screenplay, writing a novel.
Yes. Well, I've had all the experiences is because with Naked Lunch, with Cosmopolis, with Crash, I wrote the screenplay based on, but still I'm at that point fusing with the writer of the book. And with Dead Ringers, I collaborated with a friend of mine in Toronto named Norman Snyder, who wrote the first draft of Dead Ringers. But we, with my discussion about what the movie should be. And yes, the process is completely different, but it's different for every project. I mean, it can take you a very long time, or it can be very quick. For example, with Cosmopolis, I was proposed the project by Paulo Branco, a Portuguese producer, who has produced 200 movies, I think. And he came to Toronto and he handed me this book, Cosmopolis, which I knew the work of Don DeLillo, but I hadn't read that book. And he gave it to me and he said, I think you should, it was actually he and his son, and he said, we think you should make this movie, this book into a movie. And I thought, well, I don't know. I took it and I decided that I would transcribe all the dialogue in the book, just make a screenplay only of the dialogue, because Don DeLillo's dialogue is fantastic. It's very particular, yeah. And in 6 days, I wrote the screenplay. I wrote it. I wanted to see if it was a movie. And I said, it is a movie, and here it is, in 6 days. And I showed it to Paulo, and he said, yes, let's make the movie. So that was very quick. It's not always so quick. Obviously, sometimes you struggle. With Naked Lunch, it was more difficult because it wasn't just the book, it was many books of Burroughs. And for example, I talked to Burroughs a lot, and I said, I cannot make a movie only of the book Naked Lunch. I need to include your life. He's famously, of course, he shot his wife, he killed his wife by accident. There were many other incidents in his own personal life that he didn't write about in Naked Lunch, but he did write about it in other books like Queer and other of his books. And I said, William, I need to include you and the writing of Naked Lunch in this movie. But if you say that you don't want me to do that, then I won't. But then it means I can't make the movie. And he said, I don't make any distinction between my art and my life. So go ahead, no problem. And so I included those moments when he was writing Naked Lunch, of course fictionalized, but still very close to the biography of William Burroughs. So that was a totally different, longer process. So there's no one, each project is unique. It takes on its own character, and the experience you've had before will not really prepare you for what you're about to do this time. That's how I feel about it.
J'aurais une question personnelle concernant justement les auteurs adaptés. Il y en a un que vous avez essayé d'adapter par deux fois.
Those that you've tried to adapt twice, which seems quite clear with your regard to your filmography. It's Philip K. Dick. You worked quite far into an adaptation of Total Recall, and that actually ended up with Paul Verhoeven and Schwarzenegger. But you tried also to work on an adaptation of Ubik. Could you talk a little bit about those adaptations that did not succeed? Could you tell about why you didn't follow through to be able to adapt Philip K. Dick, who seems perfect for you?
No, I can't talk about it. It's too heartbreaking.
Ok, une question là.
No. Sure. Yes, I worked on, I did not, despite the fact that I read a lot of science fiction as a child, I never read Philip Dick, even though he's one of the, titans of science fiction, a very interesting writer. But then I was approached by Dino De Laurentiis, who I had made The Dead Zone with, to do a version of Philip Dick's Total Recall. He didn't call it that, but that was eventually became the title of the movie. And I worked for a year on that, and I think I wrote 12 drafts of the screenplay, along with the producer Ron Shusett, who had worked on Alien. And at a certain point, I approached the actor William Hurt to play the lead role, and eventually it was played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So you see the difference between the two movies right there. What happened, though, was that Dino's company went bankrupt, and the project disappeared, and so I never did get to make Total Recall. If I had done it, it would have been quite different from the movie that resulted, although there are some scenes in that movie that I wrote, but you don't get credit for just one scene, or two scenes. So my name is not on that movie, but and that was, of course, very disappointing. I mean, but it's part of the game. It's a very difficult game, especially the Hollywood version of movie making is very difficult. And there are other examples of projects that started and stopped and so on.
And Ubik?
Ubik, yeah. Ubik was another Philip Dick novel that relatively recently, actually, I'd say within, 8 years or 9 years, that was a project that was proposed, and I met the two sisters who are the daughters of Philip Dick, who have control over his estate, and we discussed making a movie of Ubik. But there were some problems with the producer, and my feeling was that there wasn't the proper support or understanding from the producers who were proposing it, and so I didn't ever write a screenplay of it. But I was interested. I thought it was it could have been a very interesting film, and I think people keep trying to make that into a movie. I was interested to see the series on Amazon called Man in the High Castle, which was another interesting Philip Dick novel, and I thought that series was quite good. And the two Dick sisters are listed as producers on that, so they obviously got something made.
En parlant de séries, je rebondis juste sur ce que vous disiez. Vous m'avez avoué
To
aussi tout à l'heure
react
que
to
vous
what you
regardiez
said,
beaucoup
you
de
said that
séries
you watch a
aujourd'hui.
lot of series these days, more than films actually, and that the series joins kind of intersects with the literary form. Is that something you enjoy in series now, and do you think that in the long term you could imagine seeing yourself working in a television series?
I recently have felt that there are some things that the cinema cannot do well, and that there's a certain obviously the novel is a different art form from the cinema, and I was starting to feel that there were some things that I wanted to express that I could not express in cinema. I've tried to write screenplays based on certain things that have occurred to me in my life recently and so on, and I felt that only the form of the novel really could express the subtlety and the complexity in a way that cinema is a very crude thing, I mean, yes, there are certain kinds of sophistication, but there's certain things that a novel can do that have to do with the interiority of thought and emotion that you cannot express in cinema. I mean, there really are things that you cannot express in cinema and that you can express in other art forms, including the novel. And so I was really feeling that I was finished with the cinema now, and that the next thing that I would do would write my second novel. The first novel took 8 years to write, but not because it took that long. It was because I also made 4 movies at the same time. So I would begin to write the novel, then I'd be involved for 1.5 years making a movie, then I'd come back to write the novel, and I would read it, and I'd say, I don't know if is this good, is this bad, you know. It was a difficult, strange way to write a novel. And I thought that maybe now I forget about the cinema, and I will just think about writing a novel. However, I did find that I spent a lot of time watching Netflix series. And I thought, I started to think, maybe the cinematic equivalent of the novel is really a Netflix series that maybe goes on for 5 years, 7 years. Of course, it's not just Netflix. There are many, many series. And I thought that really this is a new way, it's a new art form, really. It's not like old television series. It's really a new art form. And I was seeing some series that I thought were really quite brilliant, like Tom Tykwer's Babylon Berlin. Fantastic, and like a novel, really like a novel. And I thought maybe the cinema as we know it is really writing a short story. But if you want to write a novel, if you want to make War and Peace, then you have to do a series. And I started to think maybe I'm not finished with the cinema exactly if we think of the cinema as it is evolving. You know, I think the old cinema is finished, basically. I've talked about how I think the big screen has kind of shattered into 1 million small screens. People are watching cinema on their iPhones, on their iPads, on their laptops. It's not the cathedral of cinema as we knew it. But to me, this is not a problem. A friend of mine said, we must grieve for cinema. We must mourn the loss of cinema. And I'm thinking, not really. No. There are other things to grieve besides that. And so, so I'm thinking it's possible. I don't know if it will happen, but I'm thinking that, yes, maybe instead of writing a novel, I would do a series for Netflix, maybe. So we'll see. I don't know.
Question. Voilà, monsieur.
Merci, bonjour. En fait, j'ai 2
Good
questions.
afternoon. I have 2 questions.
La première,
The
une seule, en fait.
first, no, actually it's one. Okay, only one.
Alors, est-ce qu'au vu de tout ce qu'on vient
In the
d'écouter,
view of
est-ce
everything that
que
we've
vous pouvez
heard,
adapter
are you
son
yourself going to adapt your own novel to the screen,
C'est pas, j'ai pas lu,
consumed?
mais est-ce que
I haven't read it yet,
lui-même, il a
but
envie d'écrire
would
son
you
propre
like to
scénario?
write your own screenplay based on your own novel, or has it been done by somebody else? That's my first question.
My novel has been optioned by a producer in Canada, and he's made a deal with AMC to make a series out of it. It was happening at a time when I really did not want to direct anything. I really thought, my son has made a film, and we talk about it, and I said, I think I've suffered enough. I've suffered enough. I'm not willing to suffer anymore. And he said, well, I am. And I said, that's good, because you will. And he is trying to get his second film made. That's the way it happened. So I made it clear that I didn't want to write the series version of my novel, and I would be happy. I said, I just want to be the novelist. I'll be the novelist. I'll be Margaret Atwood, and you do Handmaid's Tale. And I'll see what it's like, and I mean, part of that is interesting. I've never been in that position before, where someone was taking something that I had created originally, and turned it into something that would be a fusion of their sensibility, and mine. And I thought that's an interesting. I would be the Stephen King in this version, and they would be me. So. I don't. It's happened. They wrote I saw a first draft of a first episode, and then they're rewriting it, and we'll see what happens. But I would maybe be, you know, an executive producer or something, just to really just to make some money. But we'll see. But that at the moment, consumed is being consumed by somebody else.
Deuxième question de monsieur.
Merci. Comment?
Allez-y pour la deuxième
Oui,
question.
alors pour la deuxième question, donc dans votre carte blanche, vous
In
avez
your carte
choisi
blanche,
5 films,
you
dont,
chose 5 films, the Jack Arnold's The Incredible Shrinking Man. I just would like to know what your view is of the old series, for instance, The Twilight Zone. What's your view of that? It's an anthology of science fiction and fantastic imagery. What's your vision of that when you were younger? You probably saw any number of those episodes since you put a film in your carte blanche that has a lot of kind of connotations or references to that kind of series. Thank you.
I mean, I watched everything on television, you know. I mean, probably 3/4 of the series on television at the time were Westerns, you know. It was, there were a million Westerns, Gunsmoke, Wanted, Dead or Alive, and that was a huge genre at the time. But there was also, there were things like The Twilight Zone. And yeah, sure, I watched that, Rod Serling and so on. I can't say, you know, it was just, as I say, it was like the air that you were breathing. So it was nothing specific. It was not, didn't make a huge impression on me at the time. It was something that you enjoyed. I'm sure it had an influence on me. But I must say, in film, there were not, I never had a mentor. You know, I mean, Brian De Palma talks about Hitchcock, how Hitchcock was always in his mind. I was always thinking I would be a novelist, so I had novelists like William Burroughs and Vladimir Nabokov were my mentors for writing. And when I started to write my first screenplay, I was really inventing myself. I really didn't have an image of a filmmaker who was a big influence on me. I really didn't. You know, I love, for example, as I have mentioned, I love Federico Fellini, but he's from such a different culture and such a different era that he didn't really, it was not really an influence other than to have me excited about the possibilities of cinema. But I can't say that he was an influence in that way. You know.
On a peut-être le temps pour une dernière question. Je crois qu'on arrive au bout de cette rencontre. Madame, au premier rang.
A woman in the front row.
Thank you. Well, you sort of started to answer what I wanted to ask you when you mentioned, because previously you talked about the science fiction influences on your work, science fiction literature, and the magazines like Amazing Stories, the magazines you mentioned, which you read when you were very young, which I remember very well. You just mentioned Nabokov and Margaret Atwood, and I wanted to know if what impact, influence, examples from classical, more traditional literature has had on you, what we call classic literature, rather than sci-fi literature or fantasy literature.
Well, I used to, my aspiration was not only to be a novelist, but to be an obscure novelist. To be a novelist that no one knew about and would accidentally discover. So, for example, when I discovered the novels of Juna Barnes, for example, someone, you know, most people don't know who Juna Barnes is, but once you discover her literature and her milieu and so on, it's very fascinating, and you discover this, and I wanted to be like that. So I can't say, and I was very interested in modern writing. I mean, of course, you know, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and so on, but those were not, I can't say that they were influences in any way. I was more interested in, you know, the Beat Generation and just modernist writing, Samuel Beckett, for example. These were writers who were difficult, maybe obscure, and I liked that. That's what I wanted to, I thought that's where I needed to be as a writer. That's the answer to that question.
Bon, une toute dernière question en bonus. One last question for you. Is it okay? One last question. Okay. Oula, va falloir. Madame au milieu, un tout petit peu plus haut. Juste, voilà.
Hello, David. Such a pleasure to see you here. I was wondering, could you tell us more about your collaboration with Clive Barker for Nightbreed? And P.S., you are absolutely stunning in that picture and scary as hell.
I love you. Will you marry me?
Anytime.
Yes. Well, of course, we haven't talked about acting, but I have acted in quite a few films. Never a huge role, except for Nightbreed, which was I spent 3 months in London shooting Nightbreed, and it was a really interesting experience. Working with Clive Barker, but also being alone on location as an actor, learning how to be an actor, because until that time I had done acting mostly in Toronto, or I think also I was in a movie called Into the Night, which starred Michelle Pfeiffer and Jeff Goldblum. John Landis directed it, but I was only in LA for 2 days doing that. And that was really the first time that I acted in a movie that wasn't a sort of underground film. When we made underground films, we all acted in each other's movies because we were cheap, But Nightbreed was different because it was a serious role, and it was an important role in the movie, and it was very interesting for me to suddenly become an actor, and doing all the things that you hate that actors do, and then I suddenly was doing those things. So, for example, the first day on the set of Nightbreed, I died. My character was killed. So there's Clive trying to get me to do this scene where I'm on a cliff and there's a knife through the body of the guy, and he grabs me, he pulls me under the knife, and I die and I fall and I hang upside down. And I say, Clive, how can I die when I haven't lived yet? I mean, I don't know how this guy dies because I don't know how he lives. And he said, you're being an actor now. And he was right. So, and it was a very interesting experience, because while I was shooting that, I was also writing Naked Lunch on my first laptop. It was a Toshiba laptop, because at that point Apple was not making laptops. And I was sitting alone in this big house they rented for me in St. John's Wood. And I was very lonely because my family, my wife and my children had been there for a week, but then they went back to Canada. And I was very melancholy and kind of lonely. And one of the other actors on the shoot, Charlie Hayde, who was famous for acting in this TV series, Hill Street Blues, he was in Nightbreed. And he said, no, you're doing it all wrong. You have to learn how to act like an actor, You don't just stay in your house and wait until they call you. We're going to go up to Stratford. We're going to rent a boat. We're going to boat down the Avon River. We're going to have fun, we'll get drunk, whatever. And so he was teaching me how to live as an actor. So that was very interesting for me. And frankly, it did help me understand actors better. I must admit that I had a much better understanding of actors after that. I think I was more compassionate afterwards. Anyway, that was my experience doing Nightbreed.
Eh bien, je crois qu'on est arrivé, on a même dépassé le temps imparti, comme on dit, donc il va falloir qu'on mette fin à cette rencontre. Merci beaucoup à vous tous d'être venus.
Our encounter, and thank to everyone, and thank you, David Cronenberg.